And by the way, to the next panelists, and Mr. West hit on this. A lot of times, what we'd rather see is a back and forth between folks from the private sector and the folks from the SBA and the GSA. So, to the extent the next panel is in place, I encourage you to listen as we go through all of these questions, but specifically these, because what we'd like you to do is respond specifically to things such as these recommendations that the request that Mr. Hare just made. Let's talk about bundling for a second, because I was surprised when you get down into the weeds of bundling. One of the It's not a loophole, but it's a gray area in the law that essentially removes, or could be determined to remove, new construction from the prohibitions on bundling. Tell us a little bit why that is and how you think we can fix that.
Well, I'm not exactly sure why that is.
The definitional issues.
Well, AGC, and I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to answer your question the way you want it, but for lack of understanding on my part. But I think AGC's view is that there are a variety of contracting vehicles that are used by the federal government, and several of the panelists here have touched on the bundling issue. We think that bundling in general, as long as you, I think what I heard Mr. Galarraza say is that perhaps you could take a series of smaller projects which could be placed in an IDIQ or a multiple award vehicle, and as long as you set those aside for small businesses, that even though that's technically bundling, it wouldn't hurt small businesses is perhaps the way to say it. And the flip side of that is what AGC looks at are these larger multiple award contract vehicles where maybe you're taking $500 million down in New Orleans and you're sticking it into a multiple award vehicle, and only large businesses are going to qualify for that, even though you may have 50 projects that could come out of that in a per project average size of $5 to $10 million. And I think the concern is if you're taking that type of bundling and sticking it into a vehicle, it does hurt small businesses and
bundling is a many splendored thing, it seems sometimes. One of the issues that we came across in one of our field hearings was that new construction, there's a prohibition on bundling in many circumstances, but because of the way the language is written, new construction is often excluded from that prohibition, so that you are allowed to bundle contracts on new construction that oftentimes effectively remove small businesses from allowing to bid, which leads me to my next question, because one of the things we heard both in California and in South Carolina when Ms. Chu and I conducted our field hearings was frustration over the amount of contract work that stayed local. The example I remember from my district was a $103 million project, of which less than $200,000 actually went to local businesses. Now, you mentioned during your testimony that generally you're concerned about a local preference, that you think it might have a negative impact. Tell me why that is, and tell me your thoughts generally on local preferences.
The concern with local preferences and many other preferences often is the reduction in competition and the price pressures that naturally occurs as a result of that. I mean, it's taking the flip side. I was in Puerto Rico at an AGC meeting last month, and the Puerto Rico AGC constantly is concerned about the fact that the larger mainland United States contractors come down there and compete in Puerto Rico for GSA projects, Corps of Engineers projects, things like that. It's sometimes a challenging set of circumstances to balance, cost with the desire to provide more opportunity for local businesses, and I think sometimes there's a tension there.
There is, and certainly, again, as Mr. Hanna said, and I think as everybody in this panel agrees, we're interested in getting the best deal for the taxpayers in both the short run and the long run, to the extent that's possible. But I can't remember if it was your testimony or Mr. McCallum's, that one of the things we struggle with in the construction business generally is the attempts to commoditize a product, recognizing that it is not a commodity product. The construction in California is different from construction in South Carolina, and that sometimes maybe under limited circumstances that could still protect the taxpayer, I do want to continue to explore the possibility of looking at local preferences, but we'll deal with that as it comes. Ms. McCallum, you talked about the size standard, which listen, we ran a small business that had very high revenues with very few number of people because we were able to subcontract out a lot of our business. You build houses, you can do that. Plus, if you're selling something that sells for a relatively large amount of money, regardless of the size of the profit margins, if you measure by revenue, you might be large, and you measure by number of employees, you might be small. But so while I share your concern and I sympathize with you to a certain extent, Tim had to deal with the other circumstance, where I might be a business that sells something that doesn't cost very much, but employs a large number of people. And that's why we run this, because we want to treat them as a small business as well. So help us walk that fine line between counting something that is a small business as a large business and vice versa.
Well, in construction, what we find is a great deal of our money is spent on material, subcontractors, equipment. So if you actually look at the size of a company, is it valued by their gross revenues, their net income? How are you really looking at that? There's not a clear definition as why they're looking at the top revenue. So if you were to look at what I actually expend in labor, that might be a better indicator of, and if you were allowed to maybe exclude out your material and subcontractors, because this is work that was actually performed by your own forces. So it would perform a commercial useful function in the construction industry. That would make sense to me. But to just say that because you do $7 million a year, you're a big business, I don't understand that. I don't think it makes sense when other companies can do $100 million and still be considered small because they had an employee count of less than 1,500 people. So how can someone who has 1,500 people still be considered small? But I'm just going to use my own company's example. If I do more than $14 million, I am not considered small, and I have less than 500 people. I can't understand that.
We struggle with it as well. As somebody who used to be in the private sector and then ended up on this committee, I was stunned to find out that not only do we do that, but we changed the definition from industry to industry. So while we're here today talking about generally construction industry, that there's a different measure for what's small within pharmaceuticals versus construction versus transportation. So we sympathize with you, and I can assure you we're trying to figure out a way to bring some reason to that system as well.